All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be diving into why 12-step recovery programs don't actually work. Now, you might be asking yourself why you should listen to me. Why the hell does my opinion on this matter? And I'm not an expert, but what I can say is that I've read a ton of books on this and I've been to several different recovery groups. So I have years of experience with this, and I also have years of experience just trying many other forms of recovery, therapy, healing, whatever you want to call it. And finally, is that I don't really have an agenda, right? So I'm neither trying to push these programs, nor am I trying to dissuade anyone from going to them. I am just trying to inform people because there is a very, very vast misunderstanding of how these programs actually work and what they're good for. If you don't know what a 12-step recovery program is, basically it is a program designed to help people that are addicted to substances to become sober. So the focus is all on don't consume this substance or don't display this behavior. And these programs, they measure all of their members, all of the people who attend, they measure them and their progress based on how many days, months, weeks, years they've been sober. In movies, you mostly will probably have seen Alcoholics Anonymous portrayed, but there are Narcotics Anonymous, there's a bunch of different kinds of these meetings, but they all revolve around the 12 steps. I'm not going to go into every single step specifically, but I'm just going to kind of address some of the ones that stand out to me and the reason that they stand out. So the first step is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Right? And each one of these steps is sort of like an action that you're supposed to take. So the first step is to admit that you were powerless over alcohol or insert substance/behavior, right? And now the reason the first step stands out to me is that, the first step in any sort of healing or recovery situation, in my experience, has been to admit not that I am powerless over the behavior, but that I do display the behavior. There's a power dynamic being created against the behavior, right? It's like, I am neither powerless nor do I power over this behavior. And actually, part of recovering for me has been accepting that I am not powerless over any behavior. I can fucking change whenever I want if I actually do the work. And as you'll notice, a lot of my gripes with the 12 steps and these programs in general is the language that is used. Step number 2 is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Pay attention to that last word, sanity. To restore us to sanity. Meaning we are supposed to admit that we are powerless, right? So we're victims. And number 2 is that we're fucking insane. Step number 3 is made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And now again, going back to step number 1, the last thing that I needed to do was to turn over my will or my care to anyone. What I needed to do was take responsibility for my care, and in a way that I wasn't. To take full responsibility of my actions, to take ownership of my life and where I led myself to. Steps number 6 and 7. We were entirely ready to have God remove all of these defects of character. Number 7, we humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. Our drinking or our behaviors or our substance abuse is not a defect of character. It is actually a solution that we found to an otherwise unsolvable problem. And so I'm just going to end it there. I'm not going to go into the rest of them, but again, generally my gripe with these is that there is a ton of shaming going on and just shame-based language that for somebody, at least in my experience, going into recovery, I already was carrying so much shame that what I needed wasn't more shame and rules to follow. It was actually, I needed to undo some of that shame and to unburden myself of it. Next, I want to talk about the word addiction itself. And I want to start by saying that addiction is nothing more than a label. And one of my biggest problems with labels is that generally they are sort of umbrella terms for a ton of different symptoms, right? So an alcoholic might be a physically abusive person, verbally abusive, they might be impulsive, they might, have poor emotional control or regulation. But not every addict is going to display all of these behaviors. And so, if I assign myself the label of addict, I am consciously or unconsciously adopting all of these symptoms as something that I am, not only something that I'm doing. Versus, and I'm not saying this is sort of the best solution, but a better option than to say I am an addict is I display addictive tendencies. And even better than that, if you know what those tendencies are, right? For me, it was poor impulse control was probably one of the biggest ones. So I can say, instead of I am an addict, I can say, there are times in my life where I've displayed terrible impulse control. Second thing, contrary to popular belief, addiction is not a disease. It's actually a solution that brings ease. So think about how opposite those two definitions are, right? Addiction is a dis-ease, meaning that the addictive behavior removes ease from our lives versus brings ease. If addiction was something that brought dis-ease into my life, I wouldn't do it. The reason that I go to addictive behaviors in the first place is because I am not at ease and I want to bring ease into my life. And I just don't know how to do that in a healthy way. So I fucking smoke marijuana or I drink alcohol or whatever your thing is. And lastly is that as an addict, I used to think I was addicted to the substance. And what I quickly came to learn is that I am not addicted to the substance. The substance is just a scapegoat, really. What I am addicted to is the underlying behavior. And I can tell you right now that 2.5 to 3 years ago, when I quit smoking marijuana, that didn't eliminate all of my problems. That only eliminated my marijuana problem. But the behavior that led me to marijuana in the first place just shifted into another substance or addictive behavior. Like, for example, consuming television or movies or YouTube videos, right? Basically, what marijuana was helping me to do was to relax and distract myself from my responsibilities and the things that were stressing me out. And so, if I just eliminate marijuana, that doesn't solve that problem. That just opens the door for me to introduce a healthy behavior. Or if I am unconscious thinking that marijuana was the problem, then I'm just gonna start doing something else that is just as unhealthy. One of my favorite speakers on addiction and recovery and just really trauma in general is Gabor Mate. And his gripe against the 12 steps is precisely, the 12 steps don't actually get to the core emotional issue. And one of my favorite questions that Gabor asks, which helped me reframe my relationship with addiction and marijuana specifically, was don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And so the way that this is sort of evolved for me over time is I used to ask myself, why can't I stop? Or how do I stop? I was focusing on the wrong question. I was focusing on the behavior. And the question that Gabor's work helped me to start asking instead was, why did I start? Because again, this is solving a deeper issue. I don't have a need to smoke marijuana. I was never physically addicted to it. So my need is not to put marijuana in my body. There is a deeper need, and I needed to sort of start to unpack that and understand why I wasn't meeting that need. Another word I want to get into is sobriety. Almost always, in my experience at recovery programs and at anonymous meetings, the word sobriety is treated as a goal. It's basically like, if you're in recovery and you're sober, then you're doing good. When the reality is that so many people who are technically sober actually fucking aren't, right? If I was an alcoholic and I stopped drinking, but then I start fucking watching 6 hours of YouTube videos and 3 hours of social media on my phone every day, I am not sober. And so the way that I started to think about it is that sobriety is not my goal. Sobriety is the byproduct of my actual goal, which is to heal the wounds that led me to addiction in the first place. Because again, abstinence by itself doesn't solve anything. But what I've found is that the more I go deep and I start to feel all of that pain that I've been running from, and I start to heal those wounds from my childhood, what happens is that sobriety just naturally starts to become more appealing to me. And it's not actually a hard thing to do, because once I learned to meet the needs that my addiction was meeting, that feels way better. And of course, this video would not be complete if I didn't also address the word relapse. Recovery programs try to make it seem like they're more open, because a lot of times they'll say relapse is a part of recovery, and yet they still give you a fucking chip every time you make it to a month or 2 months or 6 months or a year. It's like, I'm a year sober, and then if you relapse, you have to start over. You're literally measuring each other based on a number of days that you have not done something. Despite their wording, relapse is 100% treated as something to avoid. And shockingly, what I learned as I relapsed was that relapse is actually an indicator that the work I'm doing is working. Because what is the goal of the work? To bring up all my old pain and all my old wounds and to feel that and process it in a healthier way, right? But it's gonna take me a while to learn healthy coping mechanisms and to learn not to escape from my pain. And so as I do that, naturally, I'm going to want to default to my old patterns, and the process is all just about slowly replacing those with new, improved behaviors that are a little bit healthier, right? It's not about avoiding the old ones, because fuck, who knows? I might never be able to never do something again in my life. You know, that's not really even something that I want to aspire to, is to be so afraid of this one behavior that I have to do everything I can in my life to avoid it. At the end of the day, both scenarios, the substance is still controlling me. Relapse is meant to be a teacher, not an enemy. And to add to that, you know, a lot of times nowadays in my life, it takes a lot of effort, you know, to recognize when something happens that sort of shifts my emotional landscape. And one of the ways that I can tell when that's happening is when I relapse, right? Not on the more dangerous behaviors, but on the more, sadly, socially acceptable ones, like scrolling social media, you know, overworking myself. Whenever I start to do those things, that's a good time for me to stop and ask myself, hold up, what's going on? What am I running from? And now to get into a little bit more of like the nitty gritty, you know, what are the experiences actually like? So I've done 3 different recovery meetings. I've done Codependence Anonymous, Sex Addicts Anonymous, and one that was called The Heart of Recovery, which was sort of like a meditation recovery, but broad recovery, right? You don't have to have one specific addiction. And all 3 of them were different, but kind of all the same. When I went to Sex Addicts Anonymous, I was not ready to do the work. And I went to 2, maybe 3 meetings, and I started to feel a little bit better. And as soon as I started to feel better, I stopped going. And then all my behaviors came back, right? And it took me maybe 2 to 3 years to revisit recovery. And that's when I went to Codependence Anonymous. It helped me to feel like I wasn't alone. It is great for that. And it also helped me to have a space where I can talk out loud the things that I have felt I've been suffering through and process them somewhere that isn't just in my head. And this does not apply to every single meeting, right? You might go to a meeting that is diametrically opposite from the ones that I went to. But so these meetings are not actionable. They are very passive. and they can just sort of lean toward the depressing side a little bit more. Basically, after a couple of months of going to these meetings, every single person in the room just kept repeating the same story every day. Oh, this is my story. This is why I'm an addict. This is blah, 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 blah. The comparison I have is one of the men's groups that I go to now, where we still all share these sad stories, or sometimes it's celebratory or whatever, but the difference is that there's a tendency to, okay, so you've shared this, now what are you going to do about it? Because it's awesome that you shared, but the next step is to take action. And in my experience, the recovery groups I went to, it was not like that at all. If anything, it was like I can remember the faces of the people at the meetings. They just are drooping down, and they're worn, and they have bags under their eyes, and they're just hunched over. And the level of energy and consciousness that exists in those groups is not something to stay at. And I know so many people who are still in their recovery program, they're still miserable, and they're still going to the meetings, and that's just where they're going to stay at until they evolve out of the meeting and out of the program and out of the label. Which is my final gripe with the programs itself, is that I don't want this to become my identity. I don't want my life to revolve around it. I want to get in there, figure out what went wrong, address it, feel it, let it go, and then move on. I don't need to be going to fucking recovery meetings for the rest of my life. That's shame. That is like, oh, you are this thing, so just for the rest of time, you have to come here, or else it means that you're letting yourself down in your recovery or whatever. It's like, no, that's not how it works, man. I can evolve out of a level of consciousness and no longer need these meetings. And now the final thing, man, and this is, if you haven't heard about this is gonna blow your mind, because when I heard it, it blew my fucking mind. There was actually a 13th step way long ago. And one of the co-founders of these anonymous programs, Bill W., is responsible for that step. If you don't already know what I'm talking about, that 13th step was LSD. Bill W., one of the founders of this group, only got sober, like for real good sober, because he had a spiritual, mystical experience with LSD that helped reframe his thinking around addiction. And you can guess what happened. It is not going to be good for our image to say that LSD can help people in recovery. But again, my agenda here is not to persuade you one way or the other. It is just to share my story and some information that you might not know. 12-step programs, recovery, are a level of consciousness to work through, not one to stay at. So anyway, I hope that this video helps or touches you in some way. I know it would have helped me back then, and this is why I made it. Thanks for stopping by, and I will see you next time.